So thank you all for joining from across the world to today's very important webinar discussing a very important topic that we're going to introduce in a minute. 2 decades ago, the infamous UN World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa, featured a crude anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. It mainstreamed the delegitimization of Israel under the guise of human rights. The conference rehabilitated the Zionism is racism libel from 1975 UN General Assembly resolution that had been revoked in 1991. Next month, the UN General Assembly will hold a meeting in New York celebrating the 20th anniversary of Durban Hate Fest, an event which tens of countries already pull out and will not participate, like the US, United Kingdom, the Czech Republic, Netherlands, Canada, and others. Hopefully others will join. We are here today to discuss and to understand how the United Nations have been used for years by UN member states to spread modern forms of anti-Semitism and they hijacked the fight for human rights. I would like first to welcome our distinguished speakers, everyone, who are here to speak about their experience in countering the Durban Conference, what they've learned about the UN sharing anti-Israeli narrative and anti-Semitic narrative. We're going to hear from Ambassador Erdan, Gilad Erdan, with a video message. We have the Honorable Erwin Cotler with us today, Arson Ostrovsky, Olga Deutsch, Natasha Haasdorf, I hope I pronounced your name well, sorry for that, and we're going to be all introduced properly by Thomas in a minute. I would like to thank all the co-sponsors that have shared this webinar with their audiences, the Lantos Foundation, Bnei Brit International, UK Lawyers for Israel, the International Legal Forum, and NGO Monitor. Thank you for all your support and all what you have done to bring this to life. The last partner that I would like to recognize is the Tikva Fund for allowing us to work with Thomas Geetman that did a long research during the summer to understand the Durban strategy and the Durban conference. So thank you to the Tikva Fund. To start this session, I wanted you to bring back all of you in 1975, less than 30 years after the Holocaust, in the hall of the UN General Assembly to hear the very famous speech of the Israel ambassador to the United Nations at the time, Chaim Herzog, who was then later on the 6th president of Israel and is today the father of the actual president of Israel, Isaac Herzog. You're going to hear how Chaim Herzog reacted to the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the UN resolution 3379, saying that Zionism is a form of racism.
Mr. President, it is symbolic that this debate, which may well prove to be a turning point in the fortunes of the United Nations and a decisive factor as to the possible continued existence of this organization, should take place on November 10th. Tonight, 37 years ago, has gone down in history as Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Crystals. This was the night on the 10th of November 1938 when Hitler's Nazi stormtroopers launched a coordinated attack on the Jewish community in Germany. It was the night which eventually led to the crematoria and the gas chambers, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, Buchenwald, Theresienstadt, and others. It was the night which led to the most terrifying Holocaust in the history of man. It is indeed befitting, Mr. President, that the United Nations, which began its life as an anti-Nazi alliance, should 30 years later find itself on its way to becoming the world center of anti-Semitism. Hitler would have felt at home on a number of occasions during the past year, listening to the proceedings in this forum, and above all to the proceedings during the debate on Zionism. I do not come to this rostrum to defend the moral and historic values of the Jewish people. They do not need to be defended. They speak for themselves. They have given to mankind much of what is great and eternal. They have done for the spirit of man more than can readily be appreciated by a forum such as this one. To question the Jewish people's right to national existence and freedom is not only to deny to the Jewish people the right accorded to every other people on this globe, but is also to deny the central precepts of the United Nations.
That was just one part of this very famous speech at the United Nations. I would like to take you all 40 years later on in 2021, when the new actual president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, spoke at the Global Forum on Anti-Semitism in Jerusalem about the upcoming conference, which is also amazing to see where we're standing. 40 years later, we are still in the same position. Let's hear the president of Israel speaking about the Durban conference.
Here is another agenda item in front of our eyes, and that is, of course, the next Durban conference. We can analyze and understand the repercussions and results of previous rounds of the Durban conferences, and we must operate throughout the world in unanimity, in strength, with self-confidence and effectiveness to make sure to undermine the next Durban conference. Because that conference is a conference of hate and diatribe of the worst kinds, ridden with anti-Semitism in the worst sense of the word, a brainwash of what Jews are and what Israel is all about, which must be defended against by all means possible that we can use in modern day democracies, public discourse, and interface with governments and with opinion makers.
How absurd it is that 40 years later, we are still in the same narrative, the same UN narrative. One time it was at the UN General Assembly, this time is at the Durban conference. So to start the conversation of today, we are honored to have with us UN ambassador, Israel ambassador to the United Nations, also Israel ambassador in the United States, Ambassador Gilad Erdan, that sent a very strong video message to open a conversation. So we are glad that Ambassador Erdan decided to participate, to share with us its thoughts on this very dangerous conference. And also, it's important to mention that Ambassador Erdan is a forefront of the fight against anti-Zionism, against anti-Semitism at the United Nations. He fights every day for all of us. So we're very glad that he's joining this very important webinar.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the Combat Anti-Semitism movement for putting together this important event, and Professor Irwin Cotler, Canada's Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism and former Minister of Justice, NGO Monitor, the International Legal Forum, and UK Lawyers for Israel. I look forward to hearing your meaningful insights on today's urgent topic. Friends, the violent attacks against Jews all around the world during Operation Guardian of the Walls, and the fact that a swastika was found at the US State Department are alarming reminders of the severe wave of anti-Semitism we have been experiencing and of the urgency that exists to take action. The attacks were also a clear demonstration of what we have all been saying for years. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, not everyone recognizes this fact. Some are fooled by the attempts of BDS and other anti-Semitic actors to hide their bigotry behind false claims of promoting human rights and fighting racism. These are the lies they spread to justify demonizing the Jewish state and calling for its destruction. The roots of these demonization attempts were planted at the UN many years ago. In 1975, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 3379, outrageously claiming that Zionism is a form of racism. While the UN tried to remove this shameful stain on its legitimacy by revoking the resolution in 1991, it was too late. The damage was already done. The bias and anti-Israel sentiment had already penetrated the UN. It was therefore no surprise that this ugly resolution was reincarnated in 2001 at the Durban conference. The conference, which had the worthy goal of combating racism, was hijacked by the Palestinians and other anti-Israel activists. As a part of the hostile conference, a declaration was adopted. While it contained many important elements, it tragically also politicized the important fight against racism by intentionally referencing the Palestinians under the section on victims of racism. And if the Palestinians are victims, it is clear who the declaration is calling the racist attacker. This is the event and the declaration that the UN General Assembly is going to commemorate in September. It is truly shameful. We cannot stand by as disgraceful accusations against Israel are spread. These words can quite literally kill. Delegitimizing someone is too often used as legitimization to attack them. And that is why I am in the midst of an intensive diplomatic campaign to get countries to join us in refusing to participate in the commemoration event. I have sent letters and held many meetings with ambassadors to urge them to pull out of the event. Over 30 countries have adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, but only 10 countries announced they wouldn't participate in the event. So friends, we still have a lot of work left to do. According to the definition, claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor and applying a double standard to Israel is anti-Semitism. Referencing the Palestinians in the section of victims of racism in order to paint Israel as a racist country and not mentioning any specific conflict other than the Israeli-Palestinian one, a clear double standard, make the declaration clearly anti-Semitic. It is time for these countries to put their money where their mouth is and refuse to participate in the appalling commemoration event. Friends, while our campaign against the Durban event is extremely important, we must also continue to combat anti-Semitism in every country and in every institution, of course. At the UN, I am promoting two important initiatives in this regard. The first is promoting the adoption of the IHRA definition as the official definition for all UN bodies. I have already discussed this issue with Secretary General Guterres. I believe that the definition will serve as a powerful tool to combat anti-Semitism at the UN and in its bodies that have been plagued with anti-Semitism like UNRWA. I would of course greatly appreciate your help in reaching out to the Secretary General and conveying to him the importance of adopting the definition. The second initiative is a resolution to combat the ugly phenomenon of Holocaust denial. We hope to pass the resolution at the General Assembly in January, at the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, the conference in which the Nazis coordinated the final solution to the Jewish problem. Friends, the demonization and the absurd claims made about Israel and racism are not only dangerous for the Jewish state, they are also dangerous for the Jewish people. We must all continue to make that clear to every country around the world, especially those committed to fighting anti-Semitism. They must recognize that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and act accordingly. They must not take part in the Durban commemoration event or any other event that puts the lives of their own Jewish citizens at risk. Together, we will continue to fight this ancient form of hate wherever it rears its ugly head. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much to Ambassador Erdan for sharing his vision and for framing so well the problematic of the Durban conference. Also, we can guarantee you, Ambassador Erdan, that we're going to stand with you in promoting the adoption of the IHRA definition at the United Nations by many states, nation states, but also by cities and local entities. So we're definitely with you, and thank you for the great work that you are doing. I would like now to move on to Thomas Geetman, a wonderful Tikva fellow that helped putting all this great event together, inviting the speakers and building exactly the program of today. Thomas has been working during all the summer in analyzing, understanding, to be able for us to advocate against the Durban conference. And this is a very important meeting that is a result of this work. So thank you, Thomas, for what you do. And the floor is yours to lead the conversation with our wonderful speakers.
Thank you so much, Sasha. In 2001, the UN convened the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. The event, better known as the Durbin Conference, was meant to be a landmark struggle to eradicate all forms of racism. From as early as the preparatory meetings leading up to the Durbin Conference, an ulterior motive other than the ostensible purpose was evident. Jewish voices, such as Israel's delegation and Jewish NGOs, were barred from the planning conference, and the actual event became one of the most virulent breeding grounds for Jew hatred in the 21st century. The concluding document revived the rightfully repealed 1975 Zionism is Racism UN resolution libel and sought to sanitize violence against Israel under the protection of the UN human rights apparatus. The conference was also the launching site of the Durban Strategy, a cooperative attempt to delegitimize Israel by perverting international human rights laws and practicing severe historical revisionism. This strategy is based on the transformation of the principles of universal human rights into fluid criteria that are applied uniquely to Israel. The strategy perpetuates the delegitimization of Israel and foments contemporary forms of anti-Semitism under the guise of human rights while operating under the protective cover of the United Nations. The recent rise in anti-Semitic violence around the world as a result of Israel's armed conflicts is a reminder of the dangerous repercussions that such an irresponsible double standard towards Israel has on the Jewish community. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our impressive panelists. First, we have Olga Deutsch. Olga serves as vice president of NGO Monitor, an Israeli applied research institute. She brings extensive expertise in international politics and Europe-Israel relations, with particular emphasis on international development, humanitarian aid, and civil society. Deutsch is an expert in advocacy and building effective strategies to address attempts to delegitimize Israel, BDS, and modern anti-Semitism. In her capacity, she works with elected officials around the world and is fluent in Serbian, English, Hebrew, and German. Next, we have Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha is the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, a UK-based charity that advances legal education on Israel and anti-Semitism and provides legal support to victims of anti-Semitism, particularly anti-Semitism which manifests itself with regard to Israel. She is an expert on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. Natasha sits on the committee of the UK Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and is a member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews and of the JD Corps of the World Jewish Congress. Last but not least, we have Arson Ostrovsky. Arson is the chair and CEO of the International Legal Forum, an Israel-based proactive global network of over 3,000 lawyers in 40 countries, leading the fight against anti-Semitism, terror, and the assault on the state of Israel in the international legal arena. He is a leading international human rights lawyer and a voice in the pro-Israel community. Arson has been unwavering in making the case for Israel around the world, including before the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, the United Nations in New York, and to parliaments and audiences across Europe and North America. Arson is also a columnist for Newsweek magazine, where he regularly writes about Israel, Middle East, international law, and anti-Semitism. So now to get into the panel portion. I'll direct these questions to individual panelists. However, everyone is welcome to raise their hand and react and contribute. Olga, can you speak to the role that NGOs played in Durban in 2001 and how their influence has promulgated in the 2 decades following?
Yes, Thomas, thank you. And thank you, Combat Anti-Semitism, for putting this remarkable panel together. It is a pleasure to join you and Professor Irvin Cotler, Ambassador Erdan, as well as my friends and colleagues, Arson and Natasha. So let me start with basically your ending remarks, and that is the revoking of the Zionism is racism sentence that was first basically introduced in the resolution 3379 in 1975 at the United Nations. So we go way back with this concept of targeting Israel as a Jewish state, as we today call it the contemporary anti-Semitism, right? Instead of targeting Jews prior to the existence of the state of Israel. So this is not new on itself. What was new following or at the Durban conference and following in the 20 years ever since is the way it was instrumentalized and implemented globally. And here the main focus is actually on non-governmental organizations, NGOs, particularly human rights and humanitarian groups. Just to get an idea of how this played out at Durban, in parallel to the official state conference where all member states participated and discussed how to combat racism, there was a global NGO forum that was supposed to be organized in parallel and sort of recruit the civil society globally in also taking on their shoulders this important task of fighting racism in all its forms. But what happened there instead is that we had a gathering of over 5,000 NGO activists representing more than 1,500 NGOs that simply exploited this conference and the UN platform and the global stage that it received as a vehicle for promoting political warfare against Israel. I have not been there personally, but I was at the preparatory meetings back then of the student delegation of the European Union of Jewish Students, which I later on chaired as their president. And I remember also when the delegation came back, and I cannot say that I ever witnessed anything as remarkably traumatizing for young Jews ever since. I think this was the first time that we as Jewish people in the post-Second World War era experienced such institutional anti-Semitism that was wrapped around Israel, the only Jewish state in the world. The final declaration that was adopted at the Durban conference labeled Israel as apartheid, stating that it is guilty of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and war crimes. And the NGO goal that was crystallized there and clearly communicated was simple: a complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. Yes, it doesn't sound surprising because moving forward 20 years later, only earlier this year, we had one of the leading international human rights groups, such as the Human Rights Watch, issue a full-blown report on over 100 pages proving that Israel is an apartheid state. So what we refer to as the Durban strategy is unfortunately very well alive and kicking. In the 2 decades since the Durban conference, basically, we have seen an implementation of the Durban strategy by NGOs, human rights and humanitarian groups, those that are supposed to be the pioneers of protecting protecting the weak, fighting dictatorship regimes, and flagging those places and those cases where human rights are violated or there is a dire need to provide humanitarian aid. And instead, they have been pioneering a campaign, an orchestrated campaign against the Jewish state. And it has taken many different forms. I'll start with the BDS, the global boycott movement, that has sought to label both Israeli businesses or local businesses doing business with the state of Israel. And by the way, not only behind what is referred to as the green line, but in many cases, completely boycotting Israel. It has taken forms of lawfare against Israel, seeking to label Israeli politicians and military leaders as war criminals, orchestrated political efforts to block military sales equipment deals to the state of Israel. And as I said, a complete exploitation of the term apartheid. And obviously, the cynical part of it is clear here, that the Durban conference in 2001 took place in South Africa. And no other country ever since has even been brought in the context of apartheid other than Israel. What was so striking is that you had the biggest international human rights and humanitarian groups such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, War on Want, all the way to smaller groups in individual countries, and then an array of Palestinian NGOs that have participated and afterwards taken this Durban strategy and given it life, and they continue to do so. In many cases, this Durban strategy that was orchestrated there is linked and accompanied by blatant anti-Semitism. And it takes both the classic forms in using imagery such as swastikas, putting it in the middle of the Star of David and the Israeli star, but all the way to comparing Israel to Nazi regime, singling it out, and so on. It has targeted Israeli businesses and Jewish businesses. Many of these groups, particularly the Palestinian ones, have reported ties to EU, US, Canada, and obviously Israeli designated terror groups such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hamas, and Hezbollah. This strategy has also taken form of addressing international businesses by penetrating their corporate social responsibility policies in trying to introduce attempts to boycott Israel as a form of corporate social justice, right? And last, but definitely not the least, last year we have seen the culmination of the case against the State of Israel at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. By the way, the first time that this was mentioned as one of the tools or strategies to attack Israel was at the infamous Durban conference. Now, what is important to mention here when talking about NGOs as the main vehicles of implementing this strategy is that they don't do that in a vacuum. Because they have labeled themselves, and they have been labeling themselves as human rights and humanitarian groups, they have developed a type of a co-dependent relationship with governments around the world and international bodies such as the UN, Council of Europe, and so on. On one hand, these governments offer financial and other support to these groups, as they see in these NGOs important vehicles of both addressing dire violations of human rights around the world, but also as experts on providing humanitarian aid. And in return for this funding and the international platform, the NGOs are granting donor governments sort of a legitimacy because they are reaching out to the broader civil society, thus believing that they're making the entire process much more democratic. But by doing so, these NGOs are given an even greater importance because over time, they have gained such political influence that we see government after government quoting their reports as as experts and as the biggest source of facts and figures on which they base their policies. But in an attempt to zoom out, sort of, I would say that the greatest danger in what has happened in the last 2 decades since the Durban conference is that basically because of this symbiotic relationship between international development and cooperation and humanitarian programs by governments and the non-governmental organizations, there has been a process of hijacking human rights, everything that is just, and particularly when we look at the younger generations that are so far, so remote from 2001 or even what happened before, there is very little discussion on that is based on facts and figures. Rather, these groups are given almost a blank, legitimacy for just about anything they say. And in so doing, I would say, decades later, the BDS campaign actually did not succeed. There's no proof that economically much damage has been done to Israeli or Jewish businesses around the world or any other business functioning with Israel. But there is a continuous process of damaging Israel in the international human rights community.
Thank you. Natasha, as someone who has advocated for Israel in the international arena, what is the legacy of the Durban Conference and what ripple effects have the Durban Strategy had on international law?
Well, Thomas, thank you very much for the question and also to Combat Anti-Semitism for having organised this. It's a real privilege to be amongst my fellow panelists. And the halo effect that Olga has just described is a significant factor here. Also, the prominence of the Durban Conference at the United Nations, together with the fig leaf of anti-racism, all of this does have a broader impact on the increasing incitement of hatred against Jews around the world, as we've heard, at a time when we are seeing a substantial increase in anti-Jewish hate. And over the course of the last few months, we saw this manifesting itself increasingly also in violence against Jewish communities around the world. And aside from the appalling anti-Semitism that has accompanied the previous conferences, perhaps we might describe that as the unofficial legacy. The official legacy of Durban is the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action that we have heard about. Now, this, of course, dates back to the first Durban conference in 2001. And in practice, it is the 21st century reincarnation of that Zionism is racism slander. After the Zionism is racism resolution, which was first adopted, as we've heard, by the UN General Assembly in 1975, after that was revoked by the General Assembly in 1991, it really was the Durban Declaration that took its place. And according to that declaration, we've heard Palestinians are the victims of Israeli racism. Israel is the only state specifically mentioned in the entire global manifesto, notwithstanding that it purports to address racism and xenophobia the world over. It singles out the Jewish state in a manner that has become entirely acceptable in the international arena and also in academic discourse. And Olga has very aptly described the interplay between that through the vector of these NGOs. Stepping back for a moment, it also seems to follow that in order to justify their hatred in a socially acceptable way, anti-Semites need a rationale that they can pass in polite society, and ideally one that appeals directly to the highest source of authority that is currently in fashion. And anti-racism has for some time now been that vehicle. But the tactic that Durban 4 represents is certainly not a new one. it strikes me that there was also an interesting op-ed by Mahmoud Abbas in the New York Times in 2011, where he clearly set out his agenda on this. He wrote that Palestine's admission to the United Nations would pave the way for the internationalization of the conflict as a legal matter, not only a political one, and also pave the way for us, the Palestinians, to pursue claims against Israel at the United Nations, human rights treaty bodies, and the International Court of Justice. That was Abbas's declaration of lawfare, the abuse of international legal institutions to continue to wage war against Israel. And it has been incredibly successful because underpinning everything that has been happening across international legal institutions, for example, as Olga mentioned, at the International Criminal Court, underpinning it all is a deluge of propaganda and misinformation from tens of so-called human rights NGOs, civil society organizations, whose raison d'etre is to publish misinformation about Israel and international law, and to manufacture these allegations of war crimes and racism. Durbin is a big part of that. And we can see links between how the General Assembly propagates these smears and other institutions like the International Criminal Court, the ICC, rely upon them. This has been decades in the making, and the damage it is causing is not just to Israel, but to the international rule of law. And that damage is immense, as is the damage, I would say, to the real victims of human rights abuses and racism around the world. You know, when we consider that the record, for example, of the UN Human Rights Council, which was established in 2006 to address human rights issues around the globe, when 100% of the UNHRC's condemnatory resolutions in its first year targeted Israel, and when Israel remains the only country in the entire world that has a permanent agenda item dedicated to it, I see that as inextricably linked to the Durban Strategy. It serves to ignore real human rights abuses and real victims, and it devalues international law.
What would you say Durbin represents in the continuity of Jew hatred?
I would say it represents the current, more modern, acceptable form of anti-Semitism. So in terms of its focus, anti-Semitism has often looked at Jews as a collective. So while individual Jews might be tolerable, anti-Semites have had a primary problem with Jews as a separate collective identity, and therefore the targeting of Israel as the Jewish state came to prominence. And I think this is also where the analysis of the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks exemplified the mutating virus of anti-Semitism. So in the Middle Ages, for example, he explains that the highest source of authority was religion, and hatred of Jews manifested itself in the ancient blood libel and the religious elements of that, because Jews were killing Christian children, supposedly, in order to use their blood to make matzah for Passover. Well, in the post-Enlightenment period in Europe, Rabbi Sacks explained that it was science, and in fact, well, the pseudoscience of eugenics that was used to justify race hate. Whereas today, the higher source of authority, arguably, is international law and human rights. And so the language of international law and human rights is abused against the Jewish state. It is the modern form of the blood libel. And it is also intimately connected with anti-racism, which, as I explained, is extremely fashionable now. By singling out Israel in a political declaration and by propagating the blood libel in its modern form with the conference, this form of anti-Semitism is becoming more acceptable and accepted across international institutions and also across the academy.
Thank you. Arson, What effect does this type of discourse surrounding Israel have on the Jewish community as a whole?
Thank you, Thomas, for that. And first of all, I must say it's rather a difficult task I have speaking, following after Olga and Natasha, two incredible advocates and also dear friends, and then speaking before Professor Irwin Cotler. So I'll do my best. But thank you for that introduction, and thank you especially to Combat Anti-Semitism and Sasha under your leadership for all that you have done, not only in convening us, but all that you're doing in combating anti-Semitism. I think what you're doing is truly indispensable, not only as a function for the state of Israel, but also for the Jewish people worldwide and all those who care about freedom, about democracy, and really about human rights. Thomas, to answer your question in one word, I think the effect on the Jewish communities has been absolutely devastating. But before that, I wanted to say, a few weeks ago, I was in London, and together with Natasha, we were speaking to the Zionist Federation there about the UK and Durbin, with an emphasis on calling for the UK to pull out of Durbin. And as it happened, the event was in the evening, and in the morning, the UK announced they're pulling out. So we're asked, what are you going to talk about now? The UK's out. And it took me for a moment, but then, it hit me that even though we may have won that little battle in getting another state, especially a leading democratic nation such as UK, to pull out, we won that battle, but the war continues. The war rages on, the war of narratives, the war of denial of the Jewish people, of the Jewish state, our inalienable equal rights in the family of nations. So that war continues, and that I think is why it's so important for us to be here and to continue to speak out. Look, the intention of the Durban conference, I think, was noble. It was to present a united front in the fight against racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. Who wouldn't support that? Who wouldn't support that? However, backed by the multitude, especially of NGOs, and under the auspices, under the watchful eye and the full unequivocal endorsement of the United Nations. We saw in 2009 when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was speaking at the Geneva Review Conference, who was sitting behind him but Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, who stayed in the room. So what eventuated was that it became this unhinged hotbed of sheer unbridled Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, and the vilification of the state of Israel. Durbin was meant to fight racism, but in the end, Durbin became a vehicle to promote racism, and against one group and one group only, the Jewish nation, by singling us out for special opprobrium. It revived the Zionism is racism slur, the claim that Israel is an apartheid state. It distorted the Holocaust. It made allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, against Israel. And as Natasha and Olga both spoke about so eloquently in terms of how that's now been crystallized within the entire, not just the civil society and joint human rights network, but also within the UN infrastructure, within the UN bodies and the UN resolutions, as we've seen, and as we will again see come September 22nd when they vote to adopt the Durbin Declaration, the same declaration that singled out Israel for these outrageous crimes. Importantly also, I think we need to keep in mind, in light of current political circumstances, that Durbin became the birthplace of the modern BDS movement. And so what happened in 2001 is inextricably intertwined to what is happening today in 2021. Today, we're seeing anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Jew hatred, which, as far as I'm concerned, I think most of us here would agree is one and the same, surging, exploding around the world. In the 2 months of May and June, we saw over 80% in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. The CST, the Communal Security Trust in the UK, said that there was something like, I think, in excess of 500% increase in anti-Semitic attacks. We all saw the hideous, the vile scenes of the convoy of cars going through the streets of the UK chanting those abhorrent chants. We saw groups literally going through the streets of London yelling, "We want Zionists, we want their blood." This is 2021. This is not 1939 Germany. This is 2021. at the end of the day, I think this kind of explosive climate that we're seeing doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think that's imperative to underscore for all of us. The seeds of this extreme, this vicious and unrestrained outbreak of violence against Jews, of this lawfare campaign against the state of Israel, which we're seeing both at the International Criminal Court and in the UN infrastructure and the UN bodies, from the UN General Assembly, which will come to condemn Israel yet again this September, to the UN Human Rights Council, to UNESCO, and to other organizations. I think, as Professor Cotler has said a number of times, that no one is saying Israel should not subscribe to the infrastructure of international law. Of course it should, but the problem is Israel's been systematically denied equality before the international community, and none more so, I think, than at the UN, which has this ingrained, unrestrained and systematic campaign of singling out the Jewish state, applying double standards and demonizing us, denying our equal rights. I think as we've seen that throughout history, in the last 100 years, that, and again, it really underscored since what we saw in May, these kinds of actions, these words that were crystallized in Durbin 2021, they have consequences. Such hate leads to violence against Jews, and that is unequivocal. Such acts of unhinged violence that we've seen and that we continue to see of Jews literally being beaten up in broad daylight in Europe and North America are a direct result of this pervasive discourse vilifying and demonizing the state of Israel, the Jewish state, all under this pretext of purported criticism of Zionism and Israel, the very foundation of which was born in Durbin 2021. We have seen already at least 10 courageous countries stand up and say they will not participate in this festival of hate because it is inextricably tainted to anti-Semitism, and that because it singles out Israel for extreme bias and assault. But there are another 180 plus nations and UN member states that have not pulled out, that will be attending, that will be lending credence to this unrestrained festival of hate. Now, I don't so much care about Iran and Syria, North Korea and Venezuela. I know which side of history they stand. I know which side of history Iran stands, which just today is swearing in its new president, a mass murderer, a butcher and a war criminal whom the international community is embracing yet again. But what about our allies? Our allies in the allied in Europe, in the international community? Where are they? Where is France? Where is Poland? Where is Spain, Belgium, Norway, Sweden? Where are those nations? Where is their commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, to fighting racism, to standing with Israel and promoting tolerance? Anyone who truly, I think, cares about fighting this pandemic of racism, this mutating virus, as Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs referred to in a speech before the European Parliament in 2006. Anyone who truly cares about promoting tolerance should not give credence to this anti-Semitic festival of hate and ought to withdraw from Durbin 4 in September, not just for the Jewish people, not just for the state of Israel, but to show that they're truly committed to human rights, that they're truly committed to the rule of law, and that they're truly committed to fighting racism in all its forms, including anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Arson. To shift our conversation a bit towards advocacy and what we can do before our concluding remarks by Professor Cotler, Arson, can you speak about what tools we have to combat anti-Semitism and what steps we can take? And to all panelists, let's try to keep our answers like 3 minutes.
It's a great question, Thomas, because at the end of the day, I think it's all well that we are here talking about the ills, the dangers of Durbin. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, not just at the end of this conference, we have to come away with a set of action items and tools and ideas that we can all go away with, not just us as professional organizations, communities, but also to the broader public and those that are watching this webinar, those that, as I said, all over the world, wherever they may be, care about this fight. Look, I think there's a couple of things that we need to stress on. The first is education, and I'll repeat again, education. I think that is imperative, especially with respect to the youth, especially with respect to those that are on campus who are really, I think today, at the forefront of this campaign of hatred, this campaign of denial of rights, that are standing up for Israel and that are experiencing this vicious, virulent hatred and anti-Semitism masked in anti-Zionism. I think we need to use IRA as a tool. IRA is absolutely indispensable. As I said, there's been 10 countries that have already pulled out. IRA has been adopted by something like 30 plus countries around the world. It is the most endorsed, the most agreed to definition of anti-Semitism, the working definition that allows us to identify what it is and then take appropriate action. And when we look at this definition that is enunciated in IRA, that specifically talks about denial of Jewish people our rights to self-determination, that talks about Holocaust distortion, that talks about Nazi imagery, and that talks about applying a double standard to the state of Israel that is not applied to any other nation, that is textbook that is textbook anti-Semitism, and that is exactly what Durbin is, exactly what Durbin stands for, exactly what Durbin is about. Durbin is a hotbed of unbridled anti-Semitism in all its manifestations, both the old hatred that is targeted against the Jewish people and the new anti-Semitism that singles out and vilifies and attacks the Jewish state. So we need to use IRA as I think, as an indispensable tool in identifying what it is. We need to use legal tools at our means. As certainly, we've tried to do at the International Legal Forum. We need to go against those that are in breach of these anti-Semitic guidelines, those that use the cover of Zionism, those that purvey Holocaust denial, and including those that commit these acts online as well, which today is one of the single, I think, greatest battlefronts that we're dealing with. Last, I would say, we have to work with our allies. Ultimately, this is not a battle that we can win alone. It's not a battle that the Jewish people can fight alone. Anti-Semitism targets the Jews, but it never, ever ends with the Jews. So we need to work with our allies across the world, our Christian friends, our African-American friends, Latino friends, Muslim friends, all those in different faiths and cultural groups that share the common goal of fighting racism and promoting tolerance. And ultimately, the last thing is we need to tell the truth. We need to dismantle this lie, this vicious distortion and outrageous slur that Israel is an apartheid state or engages in apartheid practices, or that somehow Zionism is racism. Zionism is not racism. Zionism is a movement of our people's inalienable and right to self-determination, ancestral homeland. It is not what it is made out to be, and that's something that we need to reclaim when we're talking about the war of narratives as well.
Thank you. Natasha, can you speak a little bit about IRA in the context of international law?
Well, the IRA definition is, of course, a non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, but it is useful as a tool for identifying the anti-Semitism that we're contending with in the context of the UN, as Arson has identified. And over the last 15 years, the IRA definition has become the internationally accepted standard definition of anti-Semitism. Really, it provides an objective baseline standard for what is acceptable and what is not. And I think it's worth registering that the approach of the IRA definition follows a format that is increasingly used in administrative and regulatory documents. For example, I practice as a barrister in England, and this is the approach used in the Barristers' Code of Conduct here. It gives a general definition followed by a number of illustrative examples, and it's an approach that often achieves more clarity than a traditional form of a definition that might attempt to specify by a single verbal explanation what a term covers and what it doesn't. In January of this year, the European Commission published a handbook for the practical use of IRA, which recalled that the entities that have adopted, endorsed, or taken note of the definition include parliaments, governments, municipalities, and law enforcement agencies, as well as famously educational institutions. And I would also add that the use of such a widely accepted and adopted definition I think is crucial to the generation of reliable data on anti-Semitism and analysis of trends, which is hugely important when it comes to combating what it is that we're seeing in the UN. And of course, while the definition is clear that criticism of Israel, even in robust terms, is not captured, the examples that Arson has given, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, and otherwise applying double standards, are crucial in establishing and calling out for what it is, the activities that this panel has been devoted to. But as to how it might feature in international law, well, we have seen that the adoption of the definition amongst states is significant and increasingly widespread. And one of the sources of international law is custom, which is established by state practice. Now, state practice can create rules of customary international law, but only insofar as the practice is undertaken with a conviction that a legal right or a legal obligation is involved. So that is a limiting factor when we're dealing with IRA, which is designed as not legally binding. But if it gets to a point where it is practically universally applied, I can see there being an argument that it might at some point feature in international law. But in the meantime, it assists substantially with calling out the anti-Semitic practices of the NGOs, as well as the states that both Olga and Arson have highlighted.
Thank you. To close us off and to finish off the panel, Olga, what can we do? What are ways we can fight against the halo effect that you've spoken about, that NGOs receive by adding human rights to their name?
So I'd like to actually, it's sort of a recapping what my friends and colleagues already spoke about, because we basically are finding different words to describe the same challenge that we all face. I think the big title is, number one, we need to make sure that us and everyone else no longer talks about old and new anti-Semitism. There's only one form of anti-Semitism. We can call it contemporary, but it basically uses the medieval imageries and motifs and just puts them in a modern contemporary robe, which is embodied in Israel as the only Jewish state. So whether you call someone a Jew prior to 48 or a Zionist today, at the end of the day, you are trying to say the same. Now, we need to have that in front of our eyes as we try to break this halo effect, or the carte blanche that is being given to so-called human rights and humanitarian NGOs that have become, as Gerald, Professor Steinberg, the founder of NGO Monitor, always calls them, subcontractors for donor governments in trying to provide humanitarian aid or fight human rights violations around the world. Now, we have, to my mind, three main challenges in doing that. We need to break the halo effect within the international human rights community. We need to encourage a critical debate. NGOs, human rights and humanitarian groups, are the only policy area that no one even dares questioning any of these groups' legitimacy, their reports, sources, figures that they use, and so on. If we talk about the legal frameworks or the governmental, the public servants and the elected officials, or even the private sector, those are all bound to transparency, accountability, law, rules of market, and so on. When it comes to the international NGO community, there are no checks and balances. So we need to push for everyone to also introduce an ability to have a critical discussion on how we, as the society, but more specifically governments, engage with broader civil society. There's around There's at least $100 million that is annually provided in funding to so-called human rights and humanitarian groups that focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they are the main carriers of the so-called Durban strategy. And unless we are able to critically discuss what they actually do and whether they promote any human rights, we will not really get further than we are today. Number two, IRA is obviously the best tool that we have today. As Natasha said, it is not a legally binding definition, but I believe it might actually, exactly for that reason, be an excellent vehicle and a source of international consensus, because it is not legislated. The key word, the operative word, actually being its implementation, using it as a reference in as many policy areas and documents, while it remains a legally not binding, universally accepted definition. The governments need to also look into their existing policies, and there's many of them, and simply implement them. Speaking about implementation, not only of the IRA as a relatively new tool, right, that all the governments are now encountering, but we have anti-terror legislations and policies, we have hate speech, anti-racism policies, but when it comes to the civil society and NGOs, these are not implemented. There's not even a way of monitoring what the NGOs are doing. And the third element, because I know I have to keep my remarks short, is actually looking internally, inside. And I think that the fact that the international NGO community has sort of, when it comes to Israel and fighting anti-Semitism, has hijacked the human rights, we as the Jewish community and the dialogue between Israel and the diaspora has also suffered gravely. And we need to find ways in which we can separate the right of the state of Israel to exist as a Jewish state and the prerogative right of every Jew anywhere in the world to feel affiliated and loyal to the state of Israel without being blamed for dual loyalty of, betraying his or her own country. We need to figure a way to depoliticize the relationship between Israel and the diaspora, the Jewish communities. And until we do that, we will continue to suffer on both ends, right? We will feel that in Israel, we're lacking an incredibly important partner on side of the Jewish communities. And in return, the Jewish communities will continue to feel like they're being baselessly blamed for the policies of the state of Israel, although they are most of them not even citizens. So I think it's a threefold battle in sort of debunking the halo effect that, further than the NGOs, the international human rights community enjoys, and the carte blanche they are being given, and also taking ownership of what is contemporary anti-Semitism, and not allowing the other side to sort of separate the old from the new, and thus allow the international discussion on Zionism as if it were something, different than Jewish enable right for self-determination.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists for contributing your expertise. Just to conclude and wrap up the ideas, labeling the Durbin Conference as anti-Semitic and distinct from legitimate criticism of Israel is integral to dismantling the Durbin strategy. It removes the protective cover that the myriad of NGOs with their halo effects that Olga has mentioned and the use of the UN human rights apparatus lend to the cause. IRA represents the Jewish and international community, as Arson and Natasha have spoken to's collective dismantling of the Zionism is racism erroneous critique of Israel by preserving legitimate and equal criticism. The Jew hatred espoused at Durbin, especially the Jew hatred dressed as criticism of Israel, is the nexus point of new anti-Semitism. The particular hatred of Judaism, Jewish people, and Jewish determination that took place as outgrowths of the Durbin Declaration and effectuated by the Durbin Strategy fall squarely within the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. All countries that seek to protect their Jewish communities should adopt the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and condemn the Durbin Conference of Hate. I will now pass it back to Sasha to introduce our concluding speaker.
So first of all, thank you, Thomas, for leading this panel, and thank you to all the speakers of the panel. We are honored today to have with us Professor Irwin Cotler. Professor Irwin Cotler is an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. He's also an international human rights lawyer, advocating for the global battles against Jew hatred and other forms of discrimination. Today, Professor Cotler serves as the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's also was recently appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, as the first ever special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism for Canada. We are extremely proud, Mr. Cotler, that you are a part of the Combat AntiSemitism Movement Advisory Board. And we are even more happy that you are with us today to share your thoughts on this very important battle, your experience, and obviously as someone that has been fighting for human rights, you have so much to say about the Durban Conference. So it's an honor that you are here today to conclude this interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasha. And I begin by joining my fellow panelists and commending you and the Combat Anti-Semitism movement for organizing this very compelling seminar, and all those who have joined you in this effort. When I first heard about the planned World Conference Against Racism in Durbin in 1997, I then greeted it with both anticipation and excitement. This was to be the first World Conference Against Racism of the 21st century. It was to be the first international human rights conference of the 21st century. And it was to take place in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of South African apartheid, and where, as someone who had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, I had actually been arrested in South Africa. But what happened at Durban, as my fellow panelists so compellingly testified, was really, to use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A conference that was to combat racism turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jewish people only. A conference that was to herald the promotion and protection of international human rights in the 21st century, singled out one member state and one member people, Israel and the Jewish people, for selective opprobrium and indictment. A conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of South African apartheid became a conference for the calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. As someone who attended Durbin both as a member of the Canadian delegation at the time and who witnessed also the NGO forum, Durbin has indelibly imprinted itself on both my memory and on my being and on my advocacy. I can still hear the chanting, the marching in the streets, the marches and the chants which said that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. On September 10th, I flew back from South Africa to Canada. On September 11th, we witnessed 9/11. As one of my colleagues put it at the time, if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, then Durbin was the Mein Kampf. 20 years later, the Durbin legacy of hate finds expression not only in the old, new, escalating, global, virulent, sophisticated, and lethal anti-Semitism, but where this anti-Semitism is underpinned by a series of dynamics that are not as well appreciated as they should be. First, the mainstreaming, the normalization, the legitimation of anti-Semitism in the political culture, and the absence of outrage, underscored by indifference and inaction. Second, the globalization of phenomenon. Let's face it, Jews are a global people. What happens in London and Paris reverberates in Montreal and Toronto. And in fact, the same chants and the same marches took places. You had a convoy going through the streets of London saying, "F the Jews will kill your daughters." And you had a similar convoy going through the streets in Toronto saying the same thing. Third was the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against anti-Semitism, where education and training in government and without government with respect to combating anti-racism tends to marginalize, if not sometimes even exclude, anti-Semitism. Number four is the laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism. And number five, the revival of the classic anti-Semitic tropes of the Jews as the poisoners of the wells. And so what then can we do? May I summarize the action to be taken in a series of one-liners for reasons of time? And may I draw upon the first ever national urgent summit to combat anti-Semitism that was convened by the Canadian government just 2 weeks ago, in which it was led and with the participation of Prime Minister Trudeau, whom you mentioned, 10 other government ministers, parliamentarians, leaders of civil society, and a diverse expression of the Jewish community. It was the lived testimony of these participants which proved to be so evocative, and where after students testified, for example, about how they have been marginalized, bullied, excluded in the campus culture, forced to choose between their Jewish identity on the one hand and progressive social justice causes on the other. When Black Jewish women who participated themselves, the embodiment of intersectionality, showed how they were not only targeted as women, as Blacks, but mostly targeted as Jews. This, I think, invited the Prime Minister, who then opened his remarks by saying that the combating of the 3 Ds, the delegitimization, demonization, and double standards regarding Israel and the Jewish people will be, as it has been, a priority for our government as a matter of principle and policy. And in this, he was joined by other ministers, all of whom, I might add, referenced the importance of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. So here I will close with a number of the one-liners against this backdrop. And this took place, as I said, in the summit, and I'm drawing upon it. Number one, I would recommend that other countries be encouraged to hold similar national action summits to combat anti-Semitism and to develop national action plans for that purpose. Number two, in mid-October, Sweden will be holding in Malmö, Sweden, the 20th anniversary conference to commemorate the Stockholm Declaration, which established IRA, from which the IRA working definition was developed, which in effect set forth the principle of the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil and anti-Semitism as a paradigm for radical hate. We need to work with governments because the Malmö conference has asked participating governments to share pledges for the combating of anti-Semitism. And we need to work with them now in the formulation of those pledges. Number three, and it has been mentioned before, I won't say more about it, but enhancing not only the adoption, but the implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which is not only, as has been mentioned, the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international definition that we have, but sometimes forgotten, the most representative, because it was democratically adopted by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, scholars, and as one who was present at the creation, so to speak, I can attest to the representative character of this definition. Number four, we have to mandate, and this was also mentioned by the panel, Holocaust education and education about anti-Semitism, because this is being increasingly marginalized, I said, in both government policy and in education. Number five, we have to combat the alarming growth in anti-Semitic hate crimes. 2020 was the year in which we witnessed the highest rise of anti-Semitic hate crimes in Canada, the US, Europe, and elsewhere. what is not always appreciated is that by May 2021, in part also as a result of the Hamas war against Israel, we already reached in May 2021 the alarming levels that had been reached in all of 2020. Number 6, we need to combat the exploding incendiary anti-Semitism in the social media. We talk increasingly about international law in terms of a rules-based order. Well, the social media is a rules-free universe. And therefore, I'm delighted that the Canadian government here too, and part of the National Action Plan, said that they are introducing legislation to hold the social media accountable, as well as reform legislation for the combating of hate crimes. Number 7, we need to emphasize, as UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, Ahmed Shahid, has said, that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies, that it is an assault on our common humanity, that it is the canary in the mineshaft of global evil today, and that, as we've learned only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so there is an individual and collective self-interest, a part of principles of law, morality, and justice for the combating of anti-Semitism. Number 8, we need to have a zero tolerance policy amongst our political leaders and our political parties for the combating of anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean just calling out anti-Semitism in somebody else's political party. It means calling out anti-Semitism in our own political party, and combat also thereby the weaponization of anti-Semitism for partisan political purposes. Finally, and most directly related to the Durbin legacy, we must unmask and expose the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, and indeed, most disturbingly also, and increasingly, under the struggle against racism itself. And so I conclude by saying, this is not just about Israel or the Jewish people. This is also about combating the eroding of the integrity of the United Nations, the undermining of international law, the corruption of the culture of human rights, the shaming of anti-racism in the manner in which it is finding expression today, and for which the Durbin legacy is source and expression. In a word, we must organize a global constituency of conscience and action to combat anti-Semitism as part of and for the purpose of sharing and preserving our common humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cotler. And to conclude this event, I will just say that on behalf of all the panelist speakers, all those that have watched the event today, we just agree with everything that you said. I think that we can have someone better than you to summarize this very important discussion. And we just agree with your action plan, and we are behind you as one of the leaders of this global fight. We thank you for all what you do, and we support your actions. To conclude, I just want to thank the co-sponsor of this event, the Latos Foundation, the Bnei Brit International, the UK Lawyers for Israel, the International Legal Forum, and NGO Monitor. I would like also to thank the speakers, Olga Deutsch, Natasha Hasdorf, Arson Ostrovsky, and Thomas Geetman, representing the Tikva Fund and working with us on this amazing project. So thank you, everyone. To end and really to conclude, I would like to play a video of a campaign that was launched this week by the International Legal Forum, led by Arson Ostrovsky. And I will just say thank you, everyone. And hopefully we're going to join the fight. We're going to all be stronger together. And as I heard from everybody today, this is the fight of our generation. Thomas and I were the youngest here, also with Natasha probably. We are here to fight, and we need support of lay leaders to help us, guiding us. So thank you very much for what's happening here today. And I look forward to work with us. I will just correct some of the speakers. We are the Combat Anti-Semitism movement and not Combat Anti-Semitism. So visit our website, combatantisemitism.org, if you'd like to join our movement and work with us on different projects.
In September 2001, the United Nations held a major international conference in Durban, South Africa. Its aim? present a united global front in the fight against racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. Sounds noble, right? Except for one small problem. Durbin descended into an unhinged display of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. From reinventing modern blood libels to charging Israel with apartheid, and from equating Zionism with racism to Holocaust distortion. This conference replaced fighting racism with promoting racism and singling out Israel for condemnation. Durbin also gave rise to the modern BDS movement, which explicitly calls for the destruction of the only Jewish state. Today, anti-Semitism is escalating across the globe. The seeds of this extreme, vicious, and unrestrained outbreak were firmly planted in 2001 and fully endorsed by the UN. This September, the UN will celebrate the 20th anniversary of Durbin. A number of countries have already withdrawn, citing concerns that the Durbin Conference is tainted with anti-Semitism. Anyone who genuinely cares about fighting racism and promoting tolerance should not participate in this festival of hate. Say no to Durbin 2021.
So thank you, Arson, for producing this video. All the recording of this event and this webinar will be available on the website of Combat Antisemitism. So visit our website if you want to review, to listen once again to the speaker, and thank you, everyone.